Okay, yeah, thanks for being patient. I wanted to just give everyone a chance to kind of get in, make sure their audio is working and kind of get everything tested. So I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on how to put data into action to build resilient communities and advance equity. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Jared Roberts, and I work in marketing and member services for the University Economic Development Association. I know that many of you aren't members of UEDA, so I wanted to just share a few quick things about the association before we get started with today's programming. So for those of you that don't know, UEDA was founded over 40 years ago to strengthen the relationships between higher education institutions and economic development partners. We serve our members by promoting knowledge and practice in the realms of talent, innovation, and place as drivers of regional prosperity. Here's a list of some of the benefits. Really what I would suggest is, if you're interested in learning more about what we do, how to join, things like that, you can just visit the website, universityeda.org. But institutions can join UEDA for a fee of $645, and that covers all of your employees. A few of the member benefits include networking with your peers at our monthly gatherings, and our annual summit, access to best practices through webinars like today's, posting to our job board, increased visibility for your institution, and initiatives through our publications and through the annual Awards of Excellence program, which I'd recommend that you look into. There's a lot of information on that site about past year's winners for the Awards of Excellence and some of their initiatives and some of the ways that they're driving economic development. So that's a good resource to check out as well. And then a lot of other benefits, which we're happy to discuss one-on-one if that makes sense. And like I mentioned, you can join by visiting join.universityeda.org, and you can also learn more about some of those benefits there. One of those benefits I mentioned is sharing of best practices, and the UEDA Research Committee is embarking on a new initiative to study where economic development falls within institutions of higher education and how economic development departments are structured. So our goal is to collect a library of org charts from UEDA members and non-members to understand how institutions support economic development. And then following the study, we plan on making those org charts available to our membership as an additional resource. So if that's something that you're interested in participating in or learning more about, email yours in by November 30th, and you can send those to tim.hines@universityeda.org. It's obviously not Tim, Hines, so sorry about that last minute addition there, but tim.hines@universityeda.org, or just info@, and that's a great way to get in touch with us. We recently announced that our 2023 summit is going to be hosted in Salt Lake City, Utah this year, and that's going to be October 8th through the 10th. And the annual summit brings together national experts in leveraging college and university resources for greater economic development and community impact. Some of the attendees include domain experts from within higher education, the private sector, economic development organizations, government agencies, and research centers. So don't forget to mark your calendar for that one. And preparation for the recent UEDA summit that we hosted in San Antonio is how we actually met today's guests, or today's co-host, Metopio. They were participants in our inaugural ecosystem technology showcase, and they also sponsored the summit. So if you're not familiar with Metopio, they provide easy tools and curated verified data so you can share, collaborate, and make an impact. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Angie Grover to get today's program started. Angie's co-founder and chief operating officer of Metopio, and she's done a great job of pulling together today's program and is going to serve as moderator for that discussion.
Thank you, Jared. As he said, I'm Angie Grover, and I'm the COO of Metopio. We're proud to partner with UEDA. The summit was an amazing experience. So if you haven't checked it out, you should definitely do it. We sponsored it as a platform and products that provide curated, publicly available data and easy to use tools for visualization and collaboration. So thank you for taking the time to join us today to talk about building resilient and prosperous communities and advancing equity in planning. In this webinar, you'll receive some great insights from national leaders in economic development. Some of those will be how academic and community collaboration drives action and results. what data you can use to go beyond demographics and projections to deliver more comprehensive insights, and options for how your institution could adopt similar collaborative, data-driven approaches to build resiliency. I am going to share with you real quick as I introduce our speakers, a quick poll because we're interested in why you joined us today. So I'm going to launch this. If you could let us know why you joined us today, it'll help us frame our comments and make sure that you get what you need out of this webinar. So you'll have a few moments to do that while I introduce our fantastic panel of economic development leaders. I'm really excited. These are all fantastic people who've been working in the field for a very long time, but are also innovators. So they're not afraid of change, which I think is key to making progress in today's environment. Christine Russell is the Vice President of Strategy for Northern Kentucky Triad. And in this role, she is responsible for defining and implementing the strategic direction of the organization, as well as managing the organization's operations. And, in her career, she has led successful efforts to grow and retain jobs in communities across Ohio and secured grant funding for community efforts, as well as held leadership roles in national economic development organizations. Janet Harrah is the Senior Director of the Center for Economic Analysis and Development at Northern Kentucky University. Her experience spans 20 years in the field of applied economics, and her research has been on a wide-ranging factors affecting regional economic growth and change. Janet is actively involved in the community. She chairs and staffs community committees and projects with civic and business leaders, as well as elected officials. And Dr. Russ Mills is the Senior Director of the Center for Regional Development at Bowling Green State University. His work focuses on local economic development, improving air transportation access to communities, and examining the implications of automation on workforce and economic development. And Jana, I realized that I probably forgot your doctor as well, so I don't want to overshadow your experience. So I'm really excited. I'm going to close the poll and see that people here are, let's end this and share this with you all so you can see. Folks are really interested in data strategies, all of the above. So as long as you guys hit on data strategies, equity assessments, and ideas for collaboration, we've got a great panel for you. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Christine Russell and Janet Harrah. They're using Metopio's Atlas product to really innovate and share data across their community. Christine and Janet.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen here. Angie, give me a thumbs up. Can we see that?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. So just a tiny introduction to my organization, Northern Kentucky Triad. The Triad stands for Tri-County Economic Development. We are a 35-year-old company that covers the three northernmost counties of Kentucky, Boone, Kenton, and Campbell County. For folks that may not have visited our region, we are the southern side of Cincinnati. So Cincinnati's a river city, and we border the south side of the Ohio River, so part of a much larger metropolitan area. Oh, my slides are not advancing. There we go. So our story is still at the beginning stages. It is not yet written, and we are what I like to call in the messy middle. So I just wanted to share our journey to get to where we are and talk about what we have planned for the future. So we really saw a need for a publicly available data dashboard in our community. And so we started looking around to find, honestly, somebody else that was doing this. Our hope was that we could find somebody who was working on this, we could write them a check and then participate. Unfortunately, we could not find any other organization that was taking the lead on an endeavor like this. So we decided to step in, and we developed an initiative that we dubbed Data-Informed Community Decision Making. We tried to think of a longer title, but we couldn't. And it was included as a key component of a fundraising campaign that we launched in late 2021. This was a really big step for a few reasons. First, this was getting far outside of Northern Kentucky Triad's traditional economic development work that we had done for the past 35 years. Second, this was our first major fundraising campaign. So we had no idea how this was going to be received in the community and what level of support or lack of support we were going to see. And then third, most people don't lead a fundraising campaign with something as abstract as a data initiative when you're asking for money. But this was really how strongly we felt about the need for this in our community. So really, without having an extremely clear idea of where this was going to take us, we came up with goals and objectives for this initiative. The goal is really aspirational. We wanted to drive increased prosperity, growth, and equity in Northern Kentucky by convening around a common set of data. There's two things that are really important about this initiative. One is that it is grounded in partnerships, both partnerships by convening organizations who are going to use this data to provide a common data set for them, but also, and honestly, more importantly, to bring these groups together to discuss the data. The other really important piece of this is the partnership with Northern Kentucky University. We're launching this data initiative, but we are not data experts. We, do not have the expertise to do deep dives into this. So this partnership with Northern Kentucky University is really important to allow us to do that deep dive, help uncover the whys behind some of the data that we're seeing, and use that information to take back into the community, again, to drive better decision-making and to drive better outcomes for Northern Kentucky. This is a screenshot of the Northern Kentucky Atlas, which we worked with Metopio on. This is being formally launched on November 30th. So when I say we are in the messy middle, like we are right in the middle of all of this. To get to this point, we interviewed a couple dozen organizations in our region to first determine what type of data would be useful to them in doing their work, but also what data they collected that they would be willing to share with the public and with other folks in Northern Kentucky. So based on this feedback, we curated the topics and data points that are on this atlas to those that we thought would be most useful to our community. We have 8 overall topics and around 200 data points that are underneath those headers. And these go beyond the typical economic indicators that Triad has historically worked with. This includes things like health indicators, housing information, education, and quality of life factors. We're also actively working to add localized data sets to this, and some examples of that are airport passenger and cargo volumes. Some of you may not know the Cincinnati airport is actually in Kentucky. That is a big driver of our economy. And so being able to track that information and have that available to the public is really important. Another example is we had a request to know how many people had library cards in our region. So that's the type of very specific data that we're working with our partners, and we'll work with Metopio to add to the Atlas over time. So the Atlas does 2 really important things for us. One, it allows us to see trends over time. So how are we doing today compared to how we were 10 years ago? But it also allows us to compare ourselves and our progress to that of our peer cities. And we curated a list of, I believe it's 11 or 12 peer cities and peer metro areas, and really made sure that we have those cities that we compete with a lot for projects and talent, so we can see how we're doing compared to them. So as I said, launching this dashboard for us is very much just the start. Using this dashboard and sharing it with the community and making sure that this data actually drives progress and prosperity in our community is our end goal. So as I said, we are launching this at a big event on November 30th, publicly launch the Atlas, and also get community feedback on priority topics. We are also convening an advisory council. There's about 20 people that are on this council, and they're going to help us guide this initiative over time. We literally had our first meeting of this council yesterday, and the engagement was amazing. And I'm going to be honest, my brain is really still trying to process all the great suggestions and feedback that we got from this group of people that are volunteering to help make this the best that it can be. As I mentioned, we're also partnering with Northern Kentucky University. So once those priority topics are selected, we'll work with Janet and her team to figure out the best way to take a deep dive into those topics. We really look at this, Angie used the word collective impact, and this is absolutely a collective impact endeavor. Triad does not have the answers to these questions. We don't have the staff to do all the analysis and to fully understand each of these topics. But what we do have is a strong commitment to bring together the people that do have those answers and the people that are maybe working in the space of these topics that we decide to do the deep dive in. And so we're going to convene these folks. We're going to pull the data together. We're all going to work from that common data point. And we are really hopeful to see where it takes us. Our long-term plan here is really to move beyond data awareness and move to a point where we are establishing community goals and tracking our progress against those. So stay tuned. I'd love to come back in a year or 2 years and share where we are on this. With that, though, I'm going to turn it over to Janet Harrah, and I'm going to move her slides. So thank you so much.
Oh, Janet, you're on mute.
Yes, you would think by now we'd all have that down pat, wouldn't you? Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. As Angie noted in her introductions, I am the director of the Center for Economic Analysis and Development, or CEAD, as most people call us. CEAD is housed in the Hale College of Business at Northern Kentucky University. We engage in applied economic and regional applied economic research in support of economic development and workforce development of our region. The center was started in 2008. One of the things at the time that the business community consistently was telling the university is that we did not have a regional economist in Northern Kentucky that could really talk to the research needs of the area. So Christine, the next slide, please. The university has 3 primary pillars in its strategic plan. And one of those pillars is to engage with community partners to increase regional growth and vitality. And CEAD was constituted to help with that goal by providing research and analysis capacity. In addition to the university strategic plan, our college is also accredited by the AACSB. I didn't realize till right before we started that I had transposed my initials there. One of the new standards in 2020 was around societal impact. This refers to the ways in which a college of business, its mission and its strategic plan guides actions that positively influence the society at the local, regional, national, or international levels, with a real focus on economic development, increasing equity and economic outcomes within a community. And so to ensure that CEAD's efforts are aligned with the community work, we work very closely with a variety of community partners, including Triad. We also work with the Chamber of Commerce, the Workforce Investment Board, the Foreign Trade Zone, to name just a few. And additionally, at the state level, for example, we work with the state's Revenue Estimating Committee to set the budget for every 2 years for the state. When we have been working with Triad since the center started, so our Triad tends to focus more on convening and goal setting, particularly in this data initiative. CEAD is really focused on the deep dive research trying to do two things. One, we do kind of pre-research to ask what are some of those gaps that we see in our community? What are some of the changes that we're seeing in the data that might not be readily apparent without a bit of a deeper dive, and bring those to the attention of our community partners. And then once community partners decide that this is an area of focus for the community, then we will we will take a second deep dive looking at what are some of the potential ways to address the need or concern that was uncovered. So to give you an example of how that might work, we recently did an analysis on population growth. Our rate of population growth is slowing very, very significantly, which is driving some initiatives in the community around how do we attract and retain workforce development in the face of slowing population growth, not only here, but across the United States. That's the kind of example of where we kind of informed what is the issue, and then Triad and other community partners will come up with a strategy and a plan on how to address that. Next slide, please. Christine, can you go to the next slide? So one of the goals under societal impact is to reduce equity gaps by improving economic prosperity. And we do that through a variety of methods, which you can see listed on the screen. I think one of the most important ones we've been doing recently is looking at how do we identify and address equity gaps. We also have done some other research recently to look at equity through a variety of lenses. One of them was looking at a jobs analysis report. So for example, Triad has 5 economic clusters that it focuses on for recruitment and retention of new companies and expansion efforts. We've done an analysis of what is supply and demand for talent in those areas and asked the question, are we producing talent to address those industry needs? But what are the equity around the talent we're producing? Are we producing talent across demographic groups? So another one we've done is looking at the DEI efforts around workforce attraction and retention. We know, for example, after doing some deep dive research, that 75% of our students will stay within the MSA upon high school graduation in their early 20s and 30s. But we also know that the 25% we're losing tend to be high income children that come from high income households. And the white non-Hispanic students tend to be the ones that move most frequently. And so what that tells us as a community, for many of our low income students and for many of our people of color in our community, their opportunities for economic prosperity are going to be local. And so what do we do as a community to address that need? So these are just some of the examples of the type of deep dive research that we are engaging in to help Triad and others in the communities determine what are the efforts that we're going to focus on. In an era of very scarce resources, you have to prioritize what efforts you're going to work on. And one of the ways that we are doing that, and one of the ways we're helping the community do that, is through data, focusing on what are those most critical issues of the day and what can we do to address those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Oops. Thank you, Janet. For you and Christine, we did have a question about your interview process. So I know there are several folks involved in interviewing to identify what you needed to produce in order to move this data initiative forward. So Jeffrey from, it looks like the Ohio Innovation Exchange, wanted to know in those interviews, were the organizations interested in research expertise, shared equipment, and research capabilities, as well as licensable IP? So I'm kind of curious, when you talk to these folks, what were they telling you that they really needed to do their jobs and really pointed you in this direction?
Yeah, our questions for them were more around specific data needs. Now, I will say, as an aside, we absolutely have a need in our community for startup space and shared equipment, and there are some initiatives around that are being worked on right now. But we were specifically focused on what data do you need to do your job better? How could us developing a tool give you additional information, or what is missing from your work? Also, what gaps do you see and what challenges do you see in the community, so we knew that we were pulling data that could help address and help give us a baseline on that topic, housing affordability maybe, or certain organizations deal with 200% above the poverty level and below. And so just making sure that the data that we were going to provide was going to meet the needs of the organizations in our community.
I think the other thing that you hear a lot is community organizations want to set goals and they want to measure to those goals. And they often find that, well, you can set goals, but if you can't measure them, how do you know you're making progress? So part of what we were doing with the Atlas, trying to determine what data we needed for the Atlas, was what goals are we trying to measure? What kind of data do we need to measure whether or not we're making progress to that goals? That is, it sounds like a straightforward process, but in many cases it is not, because the goals, it's not always obvious what data is you can use to measure progress toward goals. Mm-hmm. So I know in our initial meetings, Christine is kind of glossing over. We had lots and lots of data meetings prior to launching the Atlas about what capacity, what kind of data we needed, because we would talk about goals and we'd realize we have no data to measure progress towards those goals.
Yeah, thank you. That's really important. And I think tease up our next speaker, Russ Mills. I forgot to acknowledge, Russ, you've stepped into a leadership role with UEDA as well, most recently, as president of the organization. And we have talked a lot about the need for data and how you use it in the work that you do. You use Metopio analytics. And if you could share some of the work that you're doing and how you're thinking about economic development in the larger context, that would be great.
Great. Well, thank you, Angie, and thank you, everybody. As Angie mentioned, I will be taking over as president here on January 1, so I'm very excited to have all of you here for our webinar for the University Economic Development Association, or as we call UEDA. And so, as Angie mentioned, I'm the Senior Director of the Center for Regional Development at Bowling Green State University in Ohio, not the Kentucky one where the Corvettes are made, which I always laugh when we have folks from both Kentucky and Ohio on a similar call. So I'm going to share my screen. Everybody see that okay? So I'm going to talk a bit today about how we use data to inform community decision-making and collective action in Northwest Ohio. So I'll give you a little bit of background. So our organization, the Center for Regional Development, we report currently to the Vice President of Research and Economic Engagement at our university. We serve 31 counties in Northwest Ohio that you can see there. So our biggest city in our region is Toledo, but we serve all the way down to right out the northern suburbs of the Columbus metro area as well. We view ourselves as a capacity builder and trusted partner. So I think Janet mentioned, two critical roles that our organization plays. We all are the folks who are doing the deep dives in data, but we're also the convener in our region, mainly because we don't have economic development districts in Northwest Ohio. We just had one certified a couple of weeks ago, which was great. But we still, most of our counties that you see there in orange are not covered by a development district. So we actually help communities in playing that role as well. So some of the things that we do at our center, we really try to be cutting edge and forward thinking in terms of economic demographic, and as I'll talk about today, beyond those two things and the kinds of data analysis and visualization we're bringing to our community partners. We work a lot with communities and economic development organizations on project and grant development. Again, I think that's the real role that an economic development district would play that we sort of take on a lot of times here in Northwest Ohio. We're a well-respected convener of planning processes. Today, I'll touch on some of the ones that we're currently working on in our region. One in particular being the Northwest Ohio Workforce Development Strategy and Recovery Plan that we're currently engaged with. We do quite a bit of program evaluation work in the education and health spaces. And that was one of the reasons we actually came across Metopio, and I'll share a bit about that. I do a lot of original survey research and analysis across the region, and then also our Our big event we do every year in March is our State of the Region Conference, for which we usually bring about 300 to 350 people together in Northwest Ohio. I'll also mention that we're an EDA University Center. We've been one of their university centers for about 25 years with our partners at Ohio University, who cover the southeast part of the state. So I wanted to share just some highlights and examples of how we use this. And I tend to be a graphical person, so I will have a lot of graphics on my slides. And so one of the guiding principles that I really instill in our team is that giving people data is not just enough, right? Oftentimes it's about how you present it and how you visualize it that really helps folks understand and contextualize the data that we're providing. So we spend a lot of time. We have a full-time in-house graphic designer who works with our team on taking a lot of these insights. We have obviously folks who do GIS and can make maps and all that kind of fun stuff. But I think for us, it's really about how do we present this data. So this is an example of a SEDS that were a comprehensive economic development strategy for 2 counties, Seneca and Sandusky, here in Northwest Ohio. And this is an example of a piece that we would put together that really helps of what we call a summary background. So before we start a planning process, and one that's really going to dictate or at least come up with some strategies and goals for the next 5 years for a region, we like to have everybody be on equal footing, right? And so we find that having a common data vocabulary or data definition before you do that, before you engage in planning, is really a critical component. And so we like to put together what we call sort of our 2-page snapshot of here's what the region's looking like. And, this is sort of the just basics, before we get into benchmarking and all that, which we do later when we really get into performance metrics and that stuff. This is really our sort of higher level, like, hey, where are we as a region? So you can see here, your basic population and income and poverty, commuting patterns, some of that kind of data. But one of the things I really wanted to share today was, a lot of our communities, particularly I would say over the last 3 years, really since COVID, but even before COVID, I've seen this merging of community and economic development, and I think a lot of it has to do with the workforce challenges that exist across the country today. So, the economic developers job has expanded to focusing on supply chain matters, obviously, knowing products, all that kind of fun stuff. But beyond that now to things like housing, childcare, some of the, social determinants of health is a word I keep hearing, a lot of our economic development directors using, which 5 to 10 years ago, I would have never heard them knowing those phrases or even using them in their day to day. And so I think what we're seeing is a shift in that. And so for us as a team, that meant finding data that really can help us understand better some of those community health and those social determinant of health pieces that really will help us discover, how we might better as a community get people into the workforce. And when we take care of their basic needs, that often can really help do that. So on the next slide, I'll show you, an example of, and again, and just full disclosure, some of this data comes from Metopio, some of it doesn't, right? That's another key piece I'll highlight today is really, I'm a big believer in multiple sources of data. It provides great validation. Some folks are, specialize in one area versus another. I think getting all the data you can from a variety of sources is always a great piece. And one of the things I love about Angie's company is that they encourage you to upload your own data to share, right? And I think building that collective knowledge across the country, and also building ideas for other data that we could go collect in our region is a key piece of the program that I really find useful. So you can see some of the data that we have on community health. This was something we never would have included in this kind of background in the past, right? Percent of residents on Medicaid, some of those, and I must have skipped over it before, but here on the income and poverty box, one stat that gets everybody's attention when I present it now is, why are there so many, why do we have such a high percentage of households in poverty who are not receiving food stamps or SNAP? Right. And that for a lot of community members becomes something that they latch onto and really has made, I think, including this kind of data, then I always find increases the scope of what we can include in the plan. Right. And the kind of goals that we're going to talk about aren't just focused on like the industry table there and location quotients. We're talking about people now, right, which I think is good, and I think a more holistic view for community planning. So again, I think for the way that we do our planning, again, it may be different in your community or in your organization how you arrange it, but for us, we usually start with the data to build a common vocabulary, and when we do that, the kinds of data you include on that first snapshot are vital. to really what gets discussed in the group moving forward. So again, I think that's one of the uses that we've really embraced Metopio for, is that broader set of indicators that they include in their program. I'll show you a couple examples of how we use data to inform decision making. So this is a screenshot right from the Metopio analyzer. One of the features that I really like is you can visualize the data and add points and add all kinds of things right in the program. So then you can make this honestly in a much quicker time than you would if you were exporting, then uploading into some other program to geocode and all that kind of fun stuff. So it is a convenient one for quick projects. I would say this isn't a quick project, but this was really us looking at a program evaluation of the Toledo Public Schools hub program, where they provide social services out of the schools, essentially. And so we were looking, here was just a simple overlay of where the hub locations exist, and then the percentage of households in those census tracts where folks were on and receiving SNAP benefits. So again, a quick insight. If you need a quick piece of data or something, the program is really good for that. Another project we're working on in the equity space is really around digital equity. And so we're doing that in Lucas County, which is where Toledo is located. And again, so when we were trying to focus our outreach efforts to go talk to citizens and organizations of what is the effect of not having internet access, for instance, in your neighborhood, right? We wanted to focus, right? We have a limited amount of time to do the planning and a limited amount of resources. So this really helped us focus in, again, a quick snapshot on where we're going to focus our planning efforts on the neighborhoods where there's the highest percentage of folks without internet, right? So then we can really get into those census tracts and really then begin doing our community engagement and outreach, talking to residents and citizens at different community events to really understand the impact of not having dedicated high-speed internet is having, whether it's schooling, whether it's medical appointments, be the health, I forget what they call this now, the telehealth appointments. So really understanding what those impacts are. And then finally, I wanted to talk to you a bit about so our collective action project. So it's very similar to what the folks in Northern Kentucky are doing. So we in our community, I mentioned the workforce, the Northwest Ohio workforce strategy and recovery plan that we're working on. At the same time last year, we also finished up our Toledo Region Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. And so we have this, the SEDS effort, which has its own set of performance metrics that the strategy committee developed for that effort. We also have this workforce initiative in which a key part of what we're doing with the workforce strategy is really, identifying best practices in the region, but really key and critically is identifying a set of common metrics to which we're going to assess the region's performance on improving aspects of our workforce, whether that be talent alignment, talent retention, talent attraction, as difficult as and expensive as that effort can be, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So what we decided to do was, there's a lot of overlap on the two groups that are leading those efforts in terms of our community partners. And folks said, we need to have one regional data portal, right? That houses all the data for these efforts so we can all locate it. So this was before I knew Metopio existed in the Atlas program. So full disclosure there. So we embarked on an effort and still are very much in the messy middle. I like that term. I don't know, we're in the swamp somewhere, the messy swamp, getting this thing together, but really going out and pulling all this data to build dashboards for which we're going to, very much similar to the Atlas, looking at, change over time, benchmarking against our peer communities for each of the different initiatives, so for our SEDS and for our workforce initiative. But the thing that we liked about doing it on here was we can put the events and resources also that the communities engage in around workforce and all those things. So, this is a new build site that we're doing with one of our local web developers, and then our team and our team of PhD statistics, folks smarter than me, who are programming the dashboards and making all that while we go out and collect all the different data to populate the dashboard. So again, I believe that these kinds of efforts are really important, and I know there are a lot of them going on across the country. I always say that I think Angie's tool is very good for doing this, especially because you can upload your own data. And so I think that, these efforts are vitally important, particularly as, again, for me, it's all about having a common definition, right? I get asked a lot, I spend a lot of my time somebody will come, a partner is writing a grant application and we'll say, what's our unemployment rate, or what's the raw number of our labor force? And they'll have a number from like 7 months ago, 8 months ago, and say, this is what I have. And so this will be a place where we can direct everybody in the region that are working on grant applications that will ensure is accurate. Because a lot of times, if you're not speaking with a common voice as a region, that can really hurt you in terms of asking for funding from Washington, or in our case, Columbus. So making sure that we're doing a better job of that for collective action is something that we're really looking forward to achieving with this particular effort. So happy to answer any questions folks might have. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Russ. And I think, as you've heard from our panel, there's a lot of conversation expanding the scope of economic development with this workforce challenge. So I have a couple of questions. So I want to tee us off and talk about those workforce challenges. So what are some of the variables that you've been hearing from folks when they really want to understand the health and maybe even happiness of a workforce? And Janet, I was struck by your statistic about, 25% of the folks from high income families are leaving, but the 75% that are staying, how do you generate that prosperity locally? Do you guys have some insights on that for us?
I think some of that it's really an economic development strategy in that, do you take all comers, or do you develop a strategy where you target industries to try to recruit to your community? Because not all jobs are created equally. All jobs are valuable and important to community, but if you want to grow your economy, you need to be thoughtful about what industries you go after. Christine would probably be a better person than I to even talk about some of the strategies that Triad has gone through to determine what clusters we're going to go after.
Absolutely. We spend a lot of time thinking about that. We're a small staff, and so we want to make sure that our personal efforts are being put towards jobs that will lift our community, and across the community, especially as we look at industrial projects, our land is really limited. And so thinking strategically about what is the best use for that piece of land, we do as part of our metrics, in addition to, standard things that you would expect, like number of jobs that you've helped, create. We also look at the average wages, and we set a wage goal. And, so we are very focused on making sure that we're bringing high quality jobs, and then helping companies access grants and programs that will help them upskill their employees, let's say, bringing training grants, working with our university partners at all levels, both at NKU and our community college and technical schools, to make sure that they know the sectors that we're working with and can have programs that are tailored for those industry sectors.
And to follow up on that, with the educational system and the training system, when we were looking at supply and demand for work, for jobs, one of the things we noted to our educational institutions is they had programs where they were graduating students to poverty. They were engaging in programming that the jobs, if they maxed out their job wages, they would probably make $15 to $17 an hour for the rest of their career. And is that the kind of programming we want to be offering in our educational and training system? So it informs not only the economic development process, but also the education and training system.
Right. And Russ, you mentioned families in poverty not receiving SNAP, and that's an interesting one, right? Because it's a policy one, as well as just a gap in social services. So a lot of times we'll see that in communities that are very wealthy, because they're like, there's no poor people here, we don't have to have these services. Or, does your state have policies that keep people from getting benefits they might qualify for? Do you have any other interesting insights from other ones that spark that discussion to think broader?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good one. And in some of the contexts that we have conversations around that over people that are too prideful to take it, or for political reasons don't think they want to take it. So that's another conversation we have also in a lot of our rural communities. Again, access, transportation access, etc. A lot of times transportation is something we talk about in that context as well. Another piece that I mentioned, our workforce plan and sort of the conversations we're having there. I saw a great statistic we've been using quite a bit is last year only 3.4% of people moved across county lines in the whole United States. And when you're really talking about, workforce challenges, the idea that we're going to get people in mass to move from one region to another, even with large scale employers that might be flashy, is unrealistic, particularly as interest rates continue to rise on housing. Right, people are locked into sort of fixed rates at 3 and 4, 5%. The idea of moving now becomes very difficult, especially when there are remote work options. So, a lot of regions really put a lot of focus on talent attraction, and we're going to be this place where we're going to bring everybody to us. And I think that sometimes could be a misguided approach, given just the raw number of percentage of people who are moving and some of these challenges I just mentioned. So, sometimes those kind of data points can really help, when we sort of think about a strategy of, okay, we should pick off some people where we can, and, let's really target, where we have people. And, there are other data programs we have that we can see, based on like profile data and all that kind of fun stuff, where people who were from Toledo, where they've moved, or some of that kind of fun stuff, or who went to our university, where they left and work in sort of pockets. Right. But this idea that we're going to really spend a lot on like a regional marketing and branding campaign, I think slowing some of those conversations down with some of the data can be really useful as well.
And Josh has an interesting question for us about, he says they've been exploring how to measure and display economic resilience metrics at the county and EDD scales. It's a challenge given the available data. So have any of you looked at how to measure economic resilience? And if so, what data are you relying on and how are you displaying it? I don't know if you've tackled that, but it's as we talk about building resilient, prosperous communities and thinking about that equity component, it's a good question.
Yeah,
I would
go ahead,
go ahead, Russ.
No, go ahead, Janet.
Oh, I was gonna say, I haven't looked specifically at that question, but I would pick, if you're in a smaller community, I would start with the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau has developed community resiliency measures for every county in the country. And they have a set of standard measurements they use for every community. And it gives you a good place to start. It also gives you a good framework to think about how to measure economic resiliency. I don't think it's the be all end all. I think it's just a starting point, but it's a good starting point. If for nothing else, it gives you some data and some thoughts around how to frame such a project.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I'm going to share in the chat. I sent it to Angie. I got to send it to everybody. So our good friends at EDA really put together a really nice dashboard with the folks at Aragon National Labs. It's called the National Economic Resilience Data Explorer. It has a lot of different metrics you can look at. Some of the more creative ones I've seen about, if we're talking about like climate. So resiliency is a difficult term, and one that I think a lot of people have a tough time getting their head around, because I feel like it really represents a lot right now. But for when I think of economic resiliency first, right, I think of obviously diversification of the economy, right? So having, a variety of industries that might have above average location quotients would be a nice metric to look at. How evenly wages are distributed in your community, right? Having that gap between sort of the rich school districts and the poor school districts in your community can sometimes be a good way to look at that. In terms of climate resiliency, I've seen some really interesting studies that have looked at like, hey, how many businesses are we creating in flood zones, right? Like as a negative metric of that, or in high risk climate areas, how many jobs are being created there as sort of a way to measure sort of the impact of climate resiliency. So there's a lot of different metrics out there, but the resource I shared, I think, has a lot of really interesting ones. And again, this was really focused on COVID recovery and some of those things. But again, another resource to share.
I'd also add, probably a little harder to quantify, but we try to stay very up on technology trends and look for disruptive technologies that may impact large amounts of our workforce just based on the sectors that tend to be strong in our area. Because of our location, kind of in the center of the eastern half of the United States with lots of highways, we have a lot of distribution and warehousing and logistics. How long are those jobs going to be there? When will the robots replace them? And that's something that we spend a lot of time talking about. So that definitely contributes to the economic resiliency, and having, as Russ just said, that economic diversity is really important when you have a sector that could be disrupted like that.
They have one happening right now in the corridor runs through Ohio and Kentucky, all the way down into Tennessee and in north of Canada, south to Mexico. And that is the transition from the internal combustion engine to the electric vehicle. We're seeing that, and plants are being rebuilt and rebuilt all up and down that corridor.
Yeah. So I wanted to wrap up our discussion by bringing it back to that collective impact. And you all have worked in this field for a long time. So I'm interested if you might share maybe either a atypical partner you've recently found that is making a difference in your work, or how you've expanded your circle to bring more people. You know, I really think Metopio's ethos is that if people have data, and they can share it just like you guys have talked about, you can align goals. No one organization can solve any of these problems. So it takes all of us pitching in together. And I'm just curious, what atypical partners have you guys come across most recently?
I'll start since we've just convened our advisory council. I wish I had the full list in front of me, but I'll say the partners that I have been most surprised by and just really blown away by the amount of community engagement and research that they do are the public libraries. We have three, we cover 3 counties, so we have 3 county library systems, and in a way, those folks are the front line for Joe Q Public kind of walking in and saying, I'm curious about this. How do we find out this answer? And also, as libraries are innovating, they are starting so many programs that help the community, whether it's Tableau training or how to do some of this analysis, all the way to early reading programs. And so I've just been so amazed at the range of programs that they offer, but the amount of topics that they spend time thinking about. So I would say that to me, when they first showed up on the list, I was like, the public libraries, and I have just been blown away.
So taking what Russ said about not very many people move, and you couple that with population growth slowing, I think one of the things that's really clear for the country as a whole is we can't leave people behind when it comes to workforce development. And the people on the front line of that effort to try and get people back into the workforce, people who have significant challenges, whether it's daycare or transportation, training, and that's the nonprofit sector. They're very integral to the economic development efforts, though that's not their stated mission. In fact, that they are doing a lot of that frontline work to get people back into the workforce.
Yeah, you both hit on the 2 I was going to talk about. We've worked a lot lately with our public library system, particularly our digital equity program that I mentioned. But they really are a resource in terms of social services, folks with disabilities. Like, they are really a key community partner to understanding a lot of those specific populations in our community. The other group I would say that we're beginning to work with more are our health systems and our public health offices. Really looking at one area that I was sort of unfamiliar with just because of my background, but are these community health assessments and community health improvement plans, which are basically the public health version of a SEDS in communities. And so again, as this overlap between economic and community development tends to be, I think that's a space that we want to really start getting more into and understanding how those plans are being formed, and if we might be able to work more collaboratively on those and using some of these data sources like that Angie has in Metopio to really help bridge that gap. Something that we're interested in.
And to follow up on that, Russ, I think the other thing that brings up the really good point about you need strong community partners that can convene across a wide range of organizations.
Absolutely.
And I am just so excited that Metopio can power the work that you do in the communities. That's, as an owner of a business, I love that that's the outcome of people using data is to make the world a better place and to do the important work that you guys are collaborating on and bringing to the forefront. So I just want to thank our panelists. They're all very busy and they took some time out to share their learning with us, and to UEDA for hosting the call today. And Jared, with that, do you have closing remarks?
just to kind of reiterate the same thing. Thanks again, Christine, Janet, and Russ for sharing your stories today. Really appreciate that. And thanks, Angie, and your Metopio team for helping organize the discussion and a lot of the work that you did behind the scenes leading up to it. So I appreciate that. And just for all the attendees, again, thanks for taking the time to join us. I've dropped a couple things in the chat. So there's a link there if you want to learn a little bit more about UEDA, and you can always reach out to us at those email addresses I've mentioned. And then it also includes a little bit of information on our next webinar that's co-hosted between all of UEDA's networks and the ARNI network. And that's coming up on Wednesday. So if you want to check that out, that link's in there. But other than that, that wraps up today's program. And thanks again for attending, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Have a
everybody.
great day.